My name, Jeff.
You have a guy?
Yeah. Hey, it's Wine for Real People. Today we're talking about, with my friend James, wine and food pairings as well as wine service temperatures, both long-term and short-term for wine service. Now, James, let's get into wine and food pairings. If we're talking about something that's a little bit more on the umami and sweet side, what are we going to be looking at for our wine perception?
So our wine perception, it's highlighted in red here to show it's not the greatest idea. The wine is going to seem more drying and bitter. It's going to be seen as more acidic with less perceived sweetness and less fruit characteristics. Conversely, we have salty and acidic flavors in food, which, Elijah?
In contrast to these flavors that we're going to be getting from an umami-rich or a sweet-rich food, it's sort of going to be the inverse. So we're going to be looking at our three main characteristics of bitter, dryness, and the sense of acidity. Those are going to be lowered in foods that are high in salt and high in acid, while our fruit characteristics and our perception of sweetness are going to go up. So we have these in this sort of green category, contrasting with this red category, because we're bringing in more of this unpleasant mouthfeels and perceptions. Whereas these two, the salty and acidic, we're getting more of those nicer, more rounding palate characteristics. And then we'll have this blue category, which encapsulates sort of the outliers, let's say. So we have highly flavored foods, spicy foods, and fatty and oily foods, each of which have their own category, if you will. So James, what if I'm having a super highly flavored food, thinking maybe like, oh God, I can't even think of anything. What would you say is a really highly flavored food?
I think typically anything with a lot of spices, I think would be highly flavored. As such, when you pair foods like that with wine, it's going to be a little more difficult because the wine will or might be overwhelmed by the flavors of the food. It's no less of a pairing rather than like a domination of such.
You don't like domination in wine?
I suppose not. If we're talking about like spicy Thai food, for example, our next extraneous case here, the wine will seem much increases the heat from the spice as the alcohol in the wine itself makes the heat more noticeable. This can either be seen as a benefit or a deficit, in the sense that high alcoholic wine might be paired with spicy food intentionally to make the burn more sensational in the palate. Finally, with fatty and oily foods, we know part of the basic components of flavor that acid cuts fat, so the wine will then seem less acidic as a result.
So, and a note back to the spicy comment, you might have some cultures, like I think Thai was an amazing example. You might have some cultures that are going to be really forward on the spice characteristic in their food, where they really want a nice dry wine to sort of kick that spice characteristic up. So keep in mind that it's sort of like a regional cultural difference that you're going to be making if you want to start scrolling down. So just keep that in mind, that regional differences always exist. But as we continue to talk about flavor and its perception, or rather our perception in its relation to wine, we're going to start to talk about risks in wine, more so low risk and high risk foods, what those mean, and low risk and high risk wines, and how those two sort of categories mesh. So talking about high risk foods, we're looking at the three flavors of sugar, umami, or rather we'll say the three tastes of sugar, umami, and bitterness, and then that sort of flavor trigeminal effect of a chili heat. So looking at flavors, sugar is going to have, let's see, James, you probably have a better way to put this, of sugar in its relation to wine and why it's high risk.
I mean, we just mentioned it, that sugar would be have a increase drying effect with an increase of perceived acidity or bitterness in the wine. The big thing about sugary foods is that the wine itself must also be sweet enough to stand up to the dish that it's being paired with in order to kind of equal out that sensation of sweetness. So, and even vice versa, if you have a sweet wine to begin with, you're going to want to pair it with a dessert. Hence the term dessert wine, right? Moving on to our next flavor of umami.
So umami, will essentially emphasize the tannins in your wine. So if you're drinking a nice full-bodied red wine, umamis are going to help accentuate those tannins, because tannins, as a structural component of wine, bind to proteins, and this is why you'll get that effect of sort of globulation when you're spitting out a red wine, because the saliva and the proteins in your saliva are really I guess, combining with the tannins in your red wine. So that's why you have this classic combination of red wine and red meat, because of the high amount of protein with the high amount of acidity and tannin in the red wine. More so the tannin, in this case, really helps cut through and accentuates that umami characteristic. It can also be balanced by salt or acid, and you'll see as a common thing with these 5 flavors or tastes, they balance each other in different levels. You'll see that salt and sweetness counteract each other. Umami and sort of acidity can counteract each other in different ways. So it's a constant push and pull and a tug and grab of flavors and tastes when it comes to wine and food.
Moving on, bitterness, as we mentioned before, bitter food is going to bring out a bitter taste in wine. So we want to stay away from white wines and low tannin reds. I actually might have to fact check that. I'm not actually too sure.
We'll fact check that. We'll get back to you. So moving on to chili heat, more so of a spicy characteristic, the trigeminal effect that you get from eating something spicy, you want to stay away from high alcohol wine, because as we mentioned before, the high alcohol, not even the high alcohol, no matter what the alcohol is, the perception is going to be greater. If you're enjoying a spicy food, you're going to have that perception of alcohol be much greater no matter what the alcohol perception is. So if you're already having a wine with high alcohol to begin with, it just gets to be to a point where it might be unpleasant to enjoy with your food. You also want to look at pairing with whites or low tannin reds, is sort of as a refreshing component and a refreshing pairing that sort of contrasts your wine with your spicy food. You always want to look for either contrast or similarity when you're pairing. It's a good rule to stick by.
Those were a lot of the high-risk foods. The 2 low-risk characteristics in food, again, are salt and acid. They are the easiest to pair with wine. And when you're talking about food and wine together, typically simple, not complex whites perform really. Most wines perform really well with salt or acid on the plate.
So then I think we're going to start talking about how these high risk and low risk applications relate to wine. So we had a really nice and pretty comparable quote when we talk about high-risk wines. So the most problematic wines are those with high levels of bitterness and astringency. So take it, astringency and that bitterness, those can come from oak, they can come from tannins, they can also come from winemaking, where you have maybe some stems or maybe some bits of cane or seeds even mixing in with that fermentation process. If it's maybe a lower end wine producer, you might have this sense of bitterness and astringency from that. So combined with the high levels of acidity, alcohol, and complex flavors, this really makes for a high risk wine, because you have such a level of, I don't want to say unpleasant flavors, but pronounced and perhaps off-putting in major quantities. So James, let's just touch on low-risk wine, then we can start to get into service and storage.
So conversely, low-risk wines are going to be your simple, unoaked wines that have small amounts of residual sugar. The big thing with high risk, or rather complexity in structure in wine, is that they become, the more complex your wine is, the more elements you have to pair with your wine, with your food. So with low risk wines, like your simple unoaked wines, there's less bases to cover, makes your job as a sommelier that much easier. Moving on to storage of wine.
So we're going to briefly touch on long-term service, and then we'll get into how you should be serving all sorts of different styles of wine. So talking about long-term storage and just overall preservation of wine, first of all, we're going to be talking in Celsius today, which I know we are not necessarily accustomed to living in America. We need to make this conversion if we're going to be going for this level 3 exam. So we're looking at 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, which equates to about, what's that? We're in the mid 50s.
50, 55 Fahrenheit, I think.
So what comes with this constant temperature is it needs to be exactly that. It needs to be constant. It needs to be stable. You also should be storing your wine so that its cork is on its side. You need to have wine laying horizontally so that you have as minimal contact with oxygen as possible. That makes sure that your wine is able to preserve for as long as possible. You should be storing away from strong light, as the light will slowly sort of degrade the wine on the inside of the bottle. Lastly, you should be trying to keep away from any vibrations. So if you're in California, let's say, it might not be the best idea to keep a wine cellar in your basement. So that was a bit of long-term storage. Let's talk about service, James.
All right. So when we talk about medium to full-bodied oaked whites, like, for example, we have underneath there the white Burgundy.
Which are made with what grape?
It's Chardonnay, because Chardonnay and Pinot Noir are always homies. They're always little friends. They're homies. So yeah, 10 to 13 degrees as a service temperature. Light and medium-bodied whites are going to be served at a lower temperature. So you have your Pinot Grigios, your like New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, you're going to have at 7 to 10 degrees Celsius. Sweet wines are going to kind of lie in that range of 6 to 8 degrees. So your traditional Sauternes, your sweet Muscadet, your champagnes are going to be served at around 6 to 10 degrees Celsius. So your champagne, your cava, your asti, your prosecco, what have you, all your sparkling wine should be served at that temperature. Moving on to red wines. So your light-bodied reds, like your Beaujolais or your Valpolicella, should be about 13 degrees. I know I love a nice little chill on like an Oregon Pinot Noir, something like that. And your medium to full-bodied reds, so your Bordeaux, your Burgundy, your Rioja, very, very big, robust wines, you're going to want at 15 to 18 degrees Celsius.
So James, let me ask you this. I have a really nice 2019 Mendoza Malbec I'm bringing to a party next week. What should I be thinking of for wine temperature, and to make sure I put the best foot forward for my new and emerging wine friends?
I would say for your Mendoza, your Malbec, you're going to want that 15 to 18 degrees Celsius, medium to full-bodied red service temperature.
Okay.
Looking about.
And, I think this all circles back to, if you're wondering why we have so many different ranges of temperatures, when we're looking at especially a medium to full-bodied red like that Mendoza coming out of Argentina, it's so big and full of character that you sort of have a muting of the flavors and aromas characteristics when you're at a lower temperature. So with a wine that's so expressive and complex as something like this, you would want to be able to serve it at a temperature where you're able to fully experience those flavors. Whereas a white style wine, or just any white wine in general, or a white wine styled bottle, you are able to get more of those flavors when it's chilled. So sort of the differences on either spectrum for that wine service. That was really all she wrote for today.
Yes, that's all we have. So we'd like to thank you for tuning in. And we'll see you next time when we come back tomorrow. It's going to be a nonstop 5-week thing for our WSET Level 3 exam, and concurrently our CSW exam that we're taking like the day after. So
it's going to be a fun.
It's a fun ride.
It's going to be a fun month. So we hope that you stay tuned. This is Wine for Real People. I'm Elijah.
I'm James.
Have a good one.
We'll see you, real people.